I've been going back through some of my older documentation, journal entries, saved conversations, and case analysis transcripts from a relationship that I spent years trying to understand. And while I was reviewing one particular conversation, I noticed something. The manipulation was not contained in one sentence. There wasn't one obvious moment where the other person said something so outrageous that anyone reading it would immediately recognize what was happening. Instead, the manipulation existed in the structure of the conversation. It was in the way the conversation moved, the way that the responsibility changed hands, the way I entered the conversation believing one thing and left it believing something entirely different about myself. That's what I want to examine today, not simply manipulative phrases or like a list of 10 things manipulators say, but the structure that allows an ordinary interaction to gradually become psychologically destabilizing. Because sometimes manipulation is not found in just individual words, it's found in the direction the conversation takes you. In the conversation I was reviewing, the interaction began after I made a comment that the other person interpreted as insensitive. The context involved serious instability in his life: money, drugs, legal danger, conflict with other people, and repeated references to retaliation and even violence. I made a comment that landed badly. When he told me it wasn't funny, I immediately clarified that I had not intended to minimize the situation. I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way." That should have created an opportunity for a relatively simple repair. He could have said, "Okay, I understand what you meant," or we could have discussed why the comment bothered him even. Then the conversation could have moved forward, but that is not at all what happened. Instead, the conversation expanded. He began explaining the amount of money he had recently lost, described the stress he was under, and told me that the way I joked about the situation, or acted as though it wasn't real, really affected him. I clarified again that I had not been joking about the seriousness of the situation. I apologized again. I told him he was right, that I didn't fully understand what he was dealing with because how could I? I wasn't and never had gone through anything like that before. But the repair still did not close the conversation. This is the first structural feature I noticed. The original issue becomes increasingly difficult to resolve. A misunderstanding that could have been addressed in a few sentences begins collecting additional emotional weight. More grievances are introduced, more context is added, the other person's pain becomes larger and larger, while your explanation becomes smaller and less relevant. You are no longer discussing what you actually said. You are now defending yourself against what the other person believes your statement revealed about you. In this conversation, my intent was replaced by his interpretation of my intent. He described me as snarky and said the comment felt like an "I told you so." I responded, "It wasn't like that at all. You're projecting that onto me." Because there's a difference between saying that comment hurt me and saying, "I know what you meant when you said it." The first statement describes an emotional response. The second claims authority over someone else's internal motivations. Once another person's interpretation becomes more authoritative than your own explanation, the conversation becomes almost impossible to resolve because you can apologize for the impact of your words and you can clarify your intentions, but you cannot successfully defend yourself against an intention that someone else has assigned to you. The second part of the structure is this: your attempts to repair the situation become evidence against you. I apologized. Then I explained, and then I apologized for explaining. And then I tried to reassure him that I loved him and did not want to hurt him. Eventually, I said, "I feel like I can't do anything the right way. The way I naturally am just rubs you wrong." And later, "I don't know how to be different. And I feel like the biggest piece of shit on earth." Look at the psychological distance between the beginning and the end of that progression. The conversation began with one comment that landed badly, but I did not leave the conversation thinking, "I phrased that badly." I left the conversation questioning my entire way of being. That is a major structural feature of manipulative communication. A specific behavior is gradually transformed into a global judgment of the person. You are not simply asked to reconsider something you said, you begin reconsidering your personality, your instincts, your emotional reactions, even your ability to communicate. Eventually, you are no longer asking what happened in this conversation. You are asking, what is wrong with me? And once the conversation has moved there, the original issue has almost disappeared. The third part of the structure is emotional contradiction. At one point, he told me, "You don't affect me negatively at all." Now, that sounds reassuring. But the same statement continued with, "You're personalizing that shit and it drives me nuts." So in the space of one response, I was told that I did not affect him negatively and that something I did drove him nuts. He also said he was rarely upset with me, but he had already told me that my behavior deeply affected him and that I no longer responded to him the way that I used to. This creates a confusing emotional environment, to say the least. The person says they are not angry while communicating anger. They say you are not the problem while describing your behavior as the problem. They reassure you and criticize you in the same breath. I call this pseudo-reassurance. It briefly sounds like comfort, but it does not create stability. Instead, it makes the listener work even harder to determine what is actually happening. Are they upset with me? Are they not upset with me? Am I helping? Am I failing them? Am I imagining the conflict? When contradictory messages are delivered together, the listener often stops trusting their own interpretation. They become increasingly dependent on the other person to explain what the emotional reality supposedly is. The fourth part of the structure is the transfer of emotional responsibility. He told me that he wanted me to stay with him emotionally, to weather the storm with him and to be present while he dealt with the consequences of his actions regarding what was happening in his life. On the surface, that can sound like a request for support, but context is everything. By this point in the conversation, support had begun to mean something very specific. It meant listening without reacting, not interpreting anything personally, and remaining emotionally available even when my own distress was escalating as a result of the confusion that was building. The conversation began with his stress, then I became distressed because of the way the interaction was unfolding, but even my distress was reframed as another obstacle to my ability to support him the right way. He said, "I just said don't personalize it, just be here with me." That sentence reveals the central transfer. His emotional experience remained the primary event. My emotional experience became a distraction from it. That is how emotional labor changes ownership during manipulative conversations. One person introduces the emotional crisis, the other person tries to respond and be supportive the best way they know how, and then their response is criticized, and as a result, they become increasingly anxious. Then they are expected to regulate said anxiety quickly so they can return to supporting the person who destabilized them in the first place. It's absolutely crazy making. By the end, the original speaker is no longer responsible only for their own feelings. The listener is now responsible for both people's feelings. They must understand the other person, reassure the other person, avoid upsetting the other person, correct their own emotional reaction, and remain available throughout the process. The fifth and final part of the structure is relief without resolution. After I had become extremely upset, he told me to pause and breathe. He called me baby and apologized for upsetting me and asked whether my stomach hurt. Then the conversation moved into ordinary, affectionate subjects: a drink, a purse, the color of an object, household problems, sexual jokes, plans for the future. The emotional temperature dropped. And when you are inside a dynamic like this, that drop can feel like resolution. Your nervous system has been activated, and you have spent a long period trying to explain yourself, restore connection, and figure out what the other person needs from you. Then suddenly the tension releases. They become gentle again, they comfort you, and you feel relieved. But relief is not the same thing as a resolution. The core issue was never clearly settled. There was no shared understanding of what had happened. There was no acknowledgement that my intentions had repeatedly been redefined for me. There was no examination of how one misunderstanding had escalated into me questioning my entire personality. The conflict simply dissolved into affection, and that relief becomes incredibly powerful because it teaches the nervous system that safety returns when you stop resisting, stop clarifying, and emotionally realign yourself with the other person. That is one reason these dynamics can become so difficult to recognize and leave. The same person who creates the emotional destabilization also becomes the person who ends it. They become both the source of distress and the source of relief. So when I talk about the structure of manipulation, this is what I mean. A comment or disagreement occurs. Your intention is reinterpreted. You attempt to clarify. The explanation does not resolve the issue. Additional grievances or emotional stakes are introduced. You apologize more. The focus gradually shifts from what happened to what is supposedly wrong with the way you think, communicate, or respond. Contradictory reassurance keeps you uncertain. You become responsible for restoring emotional stability. Then affection returns before the conflict is ever truly resolved. No single sentence has to look dramatically abusive. The power is in the sequence. It is in the accumulation and where the conversation takes you. That is why examining isolated quotes is not always enough. A manipulative statement may appear harmless outside the larger exchange. I just need you to be here for me can sound loving. Please breathe can sound caring. I'm sorry I upset you can sound accountable. But when those statements appear after a person has repeatedly overridden your explanation, expanded the conflict, and made you responsible for repairing the emotional environment, they function differently. Context changes meaning. Sequence reveals function. Structure reveals pattern. And perspective reveals what an isolated sentence can hide. The question is not only, what did this person say? The deeper question is, where did this conversation take me? Did I enter it feeling grounded and leave feeling defective? Did I begin by expressing a concern and end by comforting the person I confronted? Did I repeatedly answer the same accusation in different forms? Did every attempt at resolution create a new problem? Was I allowed to explain my intent? Were my emotions treated as relevant or as an inconvenience? Did the conversation end because the problem was resolved, or did it end because I surrendered, shut down, apologized enough, or accepted the other person's version of reality? That's a huge one to ask. Those questions help reveal the structure, and once you can see the structure, you no longer have to rely on finding one perfect sentence that proves manipulation occurred. You can examine the movement of the conversation. You can observe how responsibility shifts. You can notice which person's emotional reality continually becomes dominant, and you can begin trusting what the entire interaction did to you, even when every individual sentence can be explained away.